Hi, I'm Scott Bollier, host of eConversations and director of the Johnson Center for Political Economy here at Troy University. Happy New Year to you all, and thanks for tuning in to our show. Tonight we have a very distinguished and special guest joining us on set, Larry Reed from the Foundation for Economic Education, which is based both in New York and also in Atlanta, Georgia. He's the president of the Foundation for Economic Education and one of the more important contributors to free market ideas and free enterprise, reaching thousands of students each year with his summer programs and with the Freeman magazine subscription that is put out quite regularly on a monthly basis, reaching many thousands more as well. Larry, it's great to have you on the show tonight, and we're going to talk about the Great Depression, but I'd like to just first have you summarize what it's like being president of FEE and what you all do to reach people with free enterprise ideas.
Well, thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be here. FEE is 66 years old now. We were founded in 1946 by the late Leonard Reed, no relation, but a wonderful man who contributed a great deal to free market ideas. We are an educational organization focused now on 16 to 24-year-olds with summer seminars for high school and college students, shorter programs for that audience all over the country during the academic year. We publish a magazine called The Freeman. You can access that online at no charge from fee.org. And we're committed to advancing free enterprise ideas with a focus on relative newcomers, young people for whom these ideas are relatively new. We're hoping they'll go on to become opinion leaders, activists in some way, on behalf of the ideas that we think made America great.
One of the ideas that I think people who are young and in the age group that you're trying to reach are most misinformed on is the Great Depression.
Yes.
And the idea that it was the stock market that caused the Great Depression and speculation that just caused the Depression of 1929. And they're getting this in high school, I think, and also from generations of people who don't really understand the causes of the Depression. And you've written a very important article titled The Great Myths of the Great Depression, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight because it's relevant for students to understand their history, but also has some contemporary relevance when we try to understand the financial crisis as well. So what are the great myths of the Great Depression that you think students are being told that just aren't true?
Well, there are many. And of course, the biggest myth is that somehow the free economy was just chugging along and then it fell apart of its own weight or fell apart because of its own inherent flaws or contradictions, whatever. And then government had to come along, principally in the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, and save us from the Depression. But an increasing number of economists are making a pretty strong case that just the opposite is really true. That the economy fell apart in the late 1920s as a reflection of very erratic monetary policy. You had expansion of the money and credit supply by the Federal Reserve, followed by a period of some 3 years, from 29 to 33, of contraction of the money supply, tumbling prices, and then a lot of things that Congress came in and did under two administrations, Republican and Democrat, that added to the burdens of doing business, that made enterprise more costly, loaded it with penalties and regulations, and prevented recovery for at least a decade.
You've done a lot of work as well on presidents. Is your account of the presidents leading up to the Depression, Hoover and I'm trying to remember them all, Coolidge, I'm not good with my presidents, but the presidents leading us into the Depression have often been depicted as laissez-faire, committed to small government, balanced budgets, tax cuts, guys who were pro-business. And in fact, was that the case?
Well, it was largely true with Calvin Coolidge, who became president when Harding died in August of 23, and then served until March of 1929. He was very committed to small government. But his successor, Herbert Hoover, was not. And so you do have history texts typically saying, well, Herbert Hoover was a stand-pat, hands-off, laissez-faire, do-nothing president. But he was all over the place with his raising taxes. He doubled the income tax. He raised tariffs to an all-time high. He had bailout programs. He had a Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which looks a lot like many of the bailout programs of today. You don't have to take my word for it that Hoover was a radical interventionist. That's what Franklin Roosevelt said when he ran against him in '32. He ran on a platform that called for a 25% reduction in federal spending. He attacked Hoover for raising spending, raising taxes, raising tariffs. His vice presidential running mate, John Nance Garner from Texas, made the statement that Hoover was leading the country down the path to socialism. I mean, that's a word-for-word quote. And there was a lot of truth to that, because Hoover was doing all these things, which is quite the opposite, unfortunately, of what the typical textbook tells you today.
Yeah, the typical textbook, let's still keep our focus on leading up to the Depression. So they tell us that, you know, Hoover was Mr. Laissez-faire in many cases. And they also tell us that it was the stock market, margin trading that drove us into this crisis. You know, that people just suddenly became obsessed with what was happening on Wall Street, the ticker tape, and there was this mania. How do you respond to that? My thinking has always been that stock markets kind of indicate what's happening in the underlying environment.
Right.
You know, maybe it's driven by policy or other things, and sometimes you can indeed have bubbles, but that's more of a symptom than a cause of a crisis. Is that your take on the history?
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. The stock market was a mirror reflection of what the Federal Reserve was doing with the money and credit supply. We had easy money during the so-called Roaring '20s. The Federal Reserve was expanding the money supply, driving interest rates to historic lows, and much of that newly created cheap money found its way on the stock market. But when that policy of the Fed reversed itself, or the Fed reversed it to contraction of the money supply, well, that was like letting the air out of the balloon, and then the stock market crashed. But it was reflective of what was happening to money and credit. And by the way, this is not any longer very much in dispute. Even Mr. Bernanke, who runs the Fed today, admitted publicly in the presence of the late economist Milton Friedman that it was the Fed that started the Depression through its very unwise monetary policy.
Yeah, I think I remember him saying at his 90th birthday, "You were right."
Yeah, exactly.
We've learned this much from you.
Yeah, we won't do it again,
right,
supposedly.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the 29 to 33 period. You have unemployment that gets up as high as 25%. Official unemployment, unofficially, it was probably a lot higher. People had just given up on finding jobs. You have 1 out of every 3 banks closing. You have a lot of uncertainty when it comes to policy. A lot of movements around the world that ultimately spurred totalitarianism and Adolf Hitler and Mussolini. What could have been done differently during that early period to try to right the crisis? You've mentioned that money led us into it, and then we took the air out of the balloon. Are you suggesting that we should have just kept money stable or printing a lot more of it? What could have been done?
I think a more stable monetary policy throughout the 20s and 30s would have been much more helpful instead of this boom and bust in money and credit, which then had the same kind of impact on the economy. It's important to remember that in the spring of 1930, which was several months after the big crash on the stock market in the fall of '29, we didn't have a depression yet. We only had a recession in the spring of '30. Unemployment was less than it is, or in the vicinity of where it is today, about 8.5%. That was not a depression yet. But something happened in June of 1930 to take a recession and make it a depression, and that was the Smoot-Hawley tariff. That raised tariffs to an all-time high on foreign imports, virtually closed the borders. It ignited an international trade war. Any business practically involved in exporting or importing got really hit hard by Smoot-Hawley. And so Congress and the president took a recession and made it a depression in June of 1930.
When we get to 32 and onward, we have FDR showing up on the scene, and I think another myth that I've been told and that I've argued with relatives about who really believe in FDR is the idea that he ultimately provided some stability to the 1930s. He at least helped secure a bottom
Yeah.
in 33. And yes, it was a long slog out of it that we ultimately didn't escape until World War II. But he provided some confidence, and he was the right guy at that time. What's the historical record on that part of the story?
Well, yeah, we should point out that the very year he was elected, 1932, Hoover and the Republicans made another big mistake. They doubled the income tax. And so FDR inherited a mess that you could hardly imagine could be any worse. And you have to give him credit. He gave great speeches. He inspired confidence. He gave fireside chats that people found mesmerizing. They were memorable. They were inspirational. But that's apart from his policies. His policies did not have that same effect. They were actually keeping us in depression. He tried a little bit of everything. But the fact is, on the eve of World War II, unemployment was still in the vicinity of 20%. So he gave great speeches, but on policy, he kept us in depression. Not intentionally, but that was the effect of many of the destructive policies he put in place.
When we get to World War II, we have this huge run-up in production, industrial production, and a lot of the data turn around during that period. Is it fair to say that it was the war that led us out of the Depression, or is this another part of the myth? Were there other things finally changing in terms of fiscal policy, monetary policy, that were driving us back onto a recovery?
Well, with wars, you often get increasing deficit spending, and I'm not an advocate of deficit spending at any time. But with that deficit spending, you often get an increase in the money and credit supply because the central bank is trying to accommodate those deficits. It was the monetary jolt of a return to easy money that, at least temporarily, made things look a little bit better. It wasn't the war. When you think of what is war, war is the destruction of resources. Now, you may have to do it because you're fighting an avowed enemy, but we shouldn't confuse that with economic stimulus. Instead of making automobiles and refrigerators, we were making bombs and tanks and planes. And we took care of the official unemployment figures by shipping 11 million men overseas. But we didn't see an improvement in general standards of living. If anything, they may even have declined. We had rationing and shortages, black markets, until after the war. And after the war, and this is where some big spending type economists get it wrong. They like to say when the government spends more, it stimulates. When it spends less, it hurts the economy. But we saw the biggest reduction in government expenditures in American history when the war was over. And yet we saw a boom after the war. And I think they're connected because we weren't diverting resources into destruction anymore. We were making them available for the private sector. Plus, we got a big reduction in 1945 in the corporate income tax from 90% to 38%.
Wow.
And that made a huge difference in the willingness of people to invest.
Sure. Why is it that these myths persist, and why can't people just recognize that it's a lot murkier? The truth isn't that the stock market drove us into the crisis, and the truth isn't that Hoover and his predecessors were these wildcat capitalists, and the truth isn't that FDR was our savior either. Are they just the easier route to go when teaching and educating young people about it, or is there maybe some kind of an agenda that people have? What's driving the myths?
I think it's probably some of both. Certainly there has been an agenda. If you're an advocate of more government, then you're going to be more open to suggest that FDR, who gave us a lot more of it, somehow succeeded. But if you look at the evidence, you have to realize that he really didn't. The Depression was prolonged by what he did. I think, too, so much of this is wrapped up in partisan politics. The further removed we are from that period, with people not tied into the emotions of the day and the parties and so forth, they look back and increasingly the scholarship is more objective. And it's increasingly concluding that it wasn't FDR that got us out of the Depression. We muddled along in spite of what he was trying to do. We didn't recover because of what he did.
Let's try to connect the Great Depression up to the current landscape in America. We suffered perhaps the worst recession since the Depression, beginning in 2008, maybe late 2007, the Great Recession. If you look at data on unemployment, this one's been particularly bad in that job losses from the peak. It's deeper than any other recession we've had since World War II.
Yes.
If you look at how long the unemployment has persisted relative to what the experts said, it's much higher. Team Obama projected that we'd be at 6% unemployment right now, and those are very smart economists who projected that. We're actually at 8.5 or so. What lessons can you take from the Great Depression and say, here are the parallels, and what can you take from the Great Depression and say, let's not do that again when looking at the current economic environment in the U.S. This one, it wasn't stock run up so much, but housing that led us into it in terms of easy money producing a lot of homes, and then somewhat of a bubble in housing. What are the takeaways, I guess?
Well, a big one is the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, at the core of this current crisis, you had a very expansionary policy of the Federal Reserve earlier in the last decade. After 9/11, for several years you had the Fed keeping interest rates extraordinarily low. These cycles always have their own idiosyncrasies, but in this last one, because of the easy money and because of policies of Congress and regulatory agencies, a lot of that money found its way not to the stock market, but rather into the housing market. You had policies of government jawboning banks to make loans to people who really couldn't pay them back. And so much of that easy money with dirt cheap interest rates for a time was causing a bubble in the housing market. The lesson of that is government shouldn't be picking winners and losers. It ought to follow a sound and stable monetary policy. It shouldn't try to pump up any particular industry, because all it does is create a bubble and sets you up for a bust. But they don't seem to be taking to that in Washington. In so many ways, they're doing the same things all over again.
So when we say that the monetary authorities shouldn't be creating bubbles through easy money, how do you tie their hands? They're this independent entity that is really tough to affect. Ron Paul has called for auditing and some greater accountability. There are a few people out there who say we should return to a gold standard, but it's really tough to see that happening. Bernanke says he's committed to monetary rules. We're going to hit a certain inflation target or interest rate target. None of these things seem like they're really on the plate in terms of policy. Do we just muddle along with the Fed as it is, or are there's some real good policy alternatives too?
Well, there are, and there are multiple options. But I think you have to start with the recognition that the Fed has been at the source of a great deal of trouble. And it hasn't lived up to the promises that it made or that Congress made for it. When it was created almost 100 years ago, we were told it will give us just the right amount of money, it will protect the integrity of the currency, it'll promote full employment, all these things, iron out the business cycle. But yet look what we've got. We've had one Great Depression that the current Fed chairman even says was caused by the Fed, 9 or 10 recessions, and a dollar that's worth a nickel of what it was when they started. So that to me suggests we ought to be going beyond the Fed and asking ourselves, how do we put market discipline in charge of this matter of what should the money supply be, instead of politicians and people they appoint. We wouldn't do that with the green bean supply. Why should we do it with the money supply?
When you look at what the Fed's been up to since 2008, yes, the bubble in housing seems to have burst, but are we out of the woods on the bubble fully bursting? I mean, a typical symptom of a bubble bursting is the interest rates get cranked up, and then you've taken like the Great Depression, you've taken the air out of the balloon. This time, if you look at data on money supply figures, if you look at what the Fed's been doing, it's been anything but that, right? Aren't they responding in a way that suggests they're putting a lot more money into circulation? They're buying toxic assets. Interest rates are guaranteed to be at zero until like the end of 2013. And now we have Europe, which could be something that requires major Fed intervention. So where does that leave us? I know it's hard to forecast going forward, but where does that leave us as far as like future bubbles go? Are we on the cusp of another one because of their actions? Or
well, it's clear the Fed has been injecting a lot of reserves into the system, but the problem has been, of course, that's where they've stayed. for the most part, they haven't worked their way out of the banks and into the pockets of ordinary Americans. But that's understandable because there isn't a whole lot of confidence for people to want to go and borrow money and then invest it. And that's because of the political climate in Washington as much as anything. Business people, investors don't know, what's coming down the pike, but they have pretty good reason to believe it's going to be higher taxes, more spending, bigger deficits. It's not the kind of environment where you want to go borrow and invest or create a business. It's as if the Fed is trying to create another bubble, but they're sort of pushing on a string, you might say. That's an old phrase that indicates it's not taking. But there are signs now that maybe it is. And so in the short run, we might get a lift. But I worry about what it means for the longer run, that we really haven't gotten off this merry-go-round or this roller coaster of erratic monetary policy. And we're just setting ourselves up for another bust.
Business confidence seems to be a theme both in the Depression and today in terms of being a necessity to encourage a recovery. You have investors sitting on cash. A lot of businessmen, who I've spoken with some anecdotally, and you hear this if you just pay attention to the news at all, they're saying we just don't know what's ahead in terms of new regulation, perhaps new healthcare mandates and whatnot. Was there any effort to inspire business confidence in the Great Depression that had any teeth? And now when we look at today, how would you do that besides just rhetoric? What needs to be done to encourage confidence today?
Well, in the 30s, FDR had a war on business right up until the World War II began. And you saw that in the form of not only his rhetoric, but his tax proposals. He attacked Hoover for raising the top income tax rate from 24 to 65%, but before he was done, he raised it to 92%. And at one point, he even proposed a 100% tax on all incomes over $25,000. So, that's the kind of environment that just kept business in the doldrums. And you're seeing the same kind of thing with the current administration. They are piling on the taxes and the regulations. I wonder why anybody would want to take a risk right now.
If there were one thing that you could do in the way of fiscal or monetary policy to encourage growth right now, what would it be? I suppose it could be a mix of things, but is it regulation that's the big problem, or is it taxes?
It's certainly a big one, but I would say the first and foremost thing is to balance the budget, and to balance it not through tax hikes, but through spending reductions. If you could achieve a balanced budget, or at least convince people we're on a path to that within a short period of time, and not through tax hikes, you would do more to create confidence in the future than just about anything else I can think of.
And sure enough, if you look at that period at the end of World War II, you have evidence right there, going back in history, of slashing government spending and growth that's actually happening as well.
Exactly.
Perhaps an underappreciated period in American history, because as you pointed out a few minutes ago, the model right now is that if we dared to cut government spending right now, we're going to choke the recovery.
When we slashed spending after World War II, we released those resources from government use for the private sector to put to better use, and it actually was helpful in creating the post-war boom.
One other thing I want to just talk about before we go is these ideas of moral hazard and too big to fail. The concern in 2008, the argument really came down to how far could a crisis, or how much contagion is there in the system, say if Lehman fails or if Citigroup fails, versus what precedent are we setting if we bail them out. And this idea, ultimately, the Fed came down on the side of, some entities are just too big to fail, or perhaps too politically connected to fail. Citi was allowed to be propped up. Lehman was allowed to fail. So there was some real problems with the directions they let the two companies go. Is this the new normal for us in U.S. monetary policy and the U.S. economy as a whole? If you're a big enough bank, if you're a big enough company, GM isn't a bank, and they weren't allowed to fail, really. Is this where we're at?
Well,
today?
There's no question if we had allowed failures instead of the bailouts, we'd have had a sharper downturn, but we would have had a sharper response and rebound. Saying that they're too big to fail is kind of like saying you're too drunk to get sober. It seems to me that if the problem is drunkenness, you got to dry out, and you don't hand the guy another bottle. And yet that's what this government has been doing.
Yeah. I'm going to leave it there, and I really appreciate you being down here to visit us. I look forward to your talk tonight. I think it's going to be great. Tonight you're talking about free trade versus protectionism, and I bet you there may even be a mention of Smoot-Hawley in there.
Probably.
Yeah. Thanks again for being with us
My
today.
pleasure, Scott.
And thank you, viewers, for tuning in tonight to our show. Good night.